So this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're gonna kind of start digging into those actual different sections of our model of why we do what we do. And we're going to start at the very center. So last week I kind of looked at all of them, but this week we're going to start at the very center, looking at worship, the kind of very core of what it is we do as a community. So the word worship is a little difficult to define just because it is so familiar, it is such a strong connotation, and what it is people are actually doing when they worship has looked very different in very different parts of the world and very different parts of humanity, right? A modern kind of Western American worship service, which alone is a bit of a strange phrase if you think about it, with the two verbs smashed together like that. Um, it tends to be similar to like our theater or a lecture hall, many other things. I think a lot of that comes out of um, kind of our value of education. There's a person up front who is sharing things with us. So we have some analogs, but that time of worship is supposed to be that of connecting with God. But you look at different places in the world and both different religious movements or different parts of kind of God's story, and the worship may in fact be based around a ritual of sacrificing an animal. It may be based around the ritual of a group of people going from one place to another up to a sacred mountain. It may be worship may be a group of people. It may be an individual. So I think what we're mostly trying to get at with worship is connection. It's connection with God in our context, even though again worship is a part of all religious systems. But we're going to talk about our community and what it is we are trying to do in worship. So my kind of quick definition that we use is, for us at the Wayfarers Chapel, worship includes participation in communal times of worship, like the sacred gathering, that thing I was just describing, kind of the time we get together to focus on God, as well as discipleship, our rhythms and practices of spirituality, and the structure we use to be intentional about these. The last few years, it has been our community covenant. So, worship, I think, at its very essence, has to do with connection. Like I said, I think there's an aspect of submission, of bowing down and admitting that, God's definition of things, God's way of what is right and what is wrong, God's description of the overall story of human history that we try to fit ourselves into, that we try to recognize and see things from God's perspective, but we don't always. The stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell about human history of what is right and what is wrong, and who the heroes are, who the villains are, what are victories and what are failures, often does not line up with God's views on those things. We recognize that we are deeply shaped by our culture and our personalities, and of course by the fact that we are broken and fallen and sinful. And so I think an aspect of worship is that old image of bowing, of submitting, saying no. At the end of the day, you are in charge. You are right. The way you say things and describe things is ultimately more important than the ways in which I want to. And so there is an aspect of that bowing, of that submission. There's an aspect of reconnecting with kind of our story, our identities of who we are in God. And there's an aspect of, like I said, of enjoyment and connection with God as well. Again, it's not all doom and gloom and submission, although that's really important to worship. We are also called the children of God, and we are in just enjoying His presence, being reminded that there is more than kind of what we often mistake for kind of the humdrum of life. And so, yes, is the way we traditionally worship in Western society when we all go and often sing songs together, hear a sermon, sometimes share communion. Are those things really important? Absolutely, and that's why we do a very stripped down version of those um, in the sacred gathering. But I don't want us to mistake worship as something that we can only do on a Sunday morning or in a communal setting. At Wayfarers, I think I want us to be digging into the idea that worship is actually supposed to be a full lifestyle. It's a way of being in the world, an acknowledgement of God and what God is up to, of God's desire for people to be treated in a certain way as human beings rather than as obstacles or resources, right? Of of ways of serving, of ways of loving, of ways of seeing. I think worship and that awareness of God's presence, what God is doing, that submission to God's ways in the world, and that enjoyment of God are meant for something that is, yes, we can kind of concentrate that time and focus that time in our sacred gathering or other times of worship. But the end goal is, of course, to be worshiping constantly, to see God with us when we're in our workday and when we're stuck in traffic, when we're frustrated with our children, when we're doing those silly things that we enjoy, a football game or mountain biking, playing music, whatever, right? Cooking. All of these things can and should be just pieces of our overall worship. And so I wanted to kind of, if I wanted to look at one just kind of quick passage that I think describes what it is we're trying to do in worship, I chose John chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. This is Jesus talking to his disciples on kind of this last big set of teachings, this last kind of sermon right before he heads to the cross with them. And I think the connection that he is describing is obviously one that is so much bigger and fuller than getting together once a week for an hour and calling that worship. So if I wanted a description of what we're being invited into in worship, I would turn to John 15, verses 1 through 8. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vineyard keeper. He removes any of my branches that don't produce fruit, and he trims any branch that produces fruit, so it will produce even more fruit. You are already trimmed because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. A branch can't produce fruit by itself, but must remain in the vine. Likewise, you can't produce fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, then you will produce much fruit. Without me, you can't do anything. If you don't remain in me, you will be like a branch that is thrown out and dries up. Those branches are gathered up, thrown into a fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask for whatever you want and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified when you produce much fruit, and in this way prove that you are my disciples. And so I think the essence and the core of this way of being in the world that is following Jesus, and specifically of worship itself, is that image right there of the vine and the branches. God desires that our lives produce fruit, things that are meaningful, things that make the world a better place, that are as blessings. And yet, as smart and as well meaning as many of us are, we don't have the resources, we don't have the strength, we don't have the wisdom to actually produce what is deeply needed in God's beloved world, right? We need to keep connected to Jesus. We need to stay connected to God, for that source of strength. And you hear in there so many times, like, is that going to require some pruning? Yes. There are things that are part of us that we need to let go of. Not because God wants to show he's in control, but because he thinks we are better than we are. There are pettinesses, there are selfishnesses that we justify, right? That God desires us to be free of. He wants us to be, as healthy and full as we can for the sake of producing this fruit, these blessings, these goodnesses in the world. And so if we remain in him, if he continues to give us strength, again, in that metaphor, you know, a vine is the one that actually reaches down into the soil to drop the nutrients. It's the one that actually gathers the water up. It's the one that is actually giving life to the branch, which is just a conduit. But also, because it attaches, it can be part of something so much bigger. It doesn't have to produce all the fruit on its own. There are many other branches out there as well. And I think that can be very freeing when we see the immense need that is in the world. It's not all on us. It's not on us to solve every problem. It's not on us to fix everything or to carry every burden and every person we see around us. Are we part of that? Sure, we produce fruit. But it's not ultimately on us. And there's this intense joy that we can have in worship when we connect with God. And so I think one of the most essential parts of worship is, of course, the reminder of whose we are, where our source of strength, where our source of wisdom actually comes from, and that's that connection with Jesus. So worship, whether it's in kind of its concentrated form, the sacred gathering, whether it's in its daily form of the rhythms of our normal lives. The goal is, of course, to draw strength from Jesus, to draw our sustenance, to draw our enjoyment from God and Jesus. He is there, He is available in both difficult situations and in joyous ones. And so, worship, the rhythm of worship that we want to kind of lace our entire life, comes down to this image: remaining in God, enjoying God, worshiping God day in and day out, that we can be connected to the roots, connected to the vine, since we are simply the branches.